Hello, my name's Steve Bromley, and I'm really excited to bring this topic to you today, setting the stage for research success. I'm going to be talking about how understanding our stakeholders will allow us to run better research and how putting time and effort into the work before even your kickoff meeting will have a huge impact on your impact later on in your research process, and ultimately is time well spent. First of all, a little bit about me. So my name is Steve Bromley. I've been in and around the games industry for, I think, 13 or 14 years now. I started my career at Sony PlayStation in the UK. And since then, I now work as an independent consultant, running studies, doing training, helping teams integrate user research into their development process and helping user researchers have better impact. I've had a long history of talking about research. I wrote the book, How to Be a Games User Researcher. I also co-ran the first few European conferences on games user research and started the IGDA's mentoring scheme. So this is a topic I talk about a lot, which is why I'm excited to bring it to you today. And what I currently do is run gamesuserresearch.com. We do a combination of training, consulting, and coaching for teams to help them integrate user research or have more impact with their user research. And also I run studies, helping teams with usability testing or play tests, or supporting teams when they don't have in-house capability or scale to do this type of work. That means I have first-hand experience of all the challenges I'll talk about today. And what I hope to share is some of the approaches that I personally have taken to try and make sure that the studies are having the impact they deserve. Which brings me to the topic. In my opinion, I think after you hit mid-level as a researcher, the challenge often isn't how do we run a research study. You'll have ended up with a toolkit of methods like observation, interviews, being able to design a survey, and you can put those together into any number of formats to help actually run the studies that you need to run. Instead, I think the challenge becomes not running the study, but how do you create an environment in which running the study matters? I picked this topic because I think it is more human, harder, more messy and squishy as a topic, but ultimately is really important. You'll quickly find that regardless of the quality of your study, actually your studies aren't having the impact they deserve, or you're getting ignored, or you're getting pushback. And it's not because of a knowledge gap. It's not because people don't know what user research is or don't know what you do, or even that they don't believe your findings. They might believe them. Instead, we haven't understood what's important to our teams and the environment in which decisions get made. And we're not using that information to make our work impactful and seem relevant. So in the time we have together today, I wanted to first talk about recognizing if you're in an environment where you haven't achieved that alignment and you haven't understood your stakeholders sufficiently and what that can look like. And then we're going to talk about some practical steps for actually achieving that. How do you understand the environment and the people that you work with and make sure that you are having the right impact with your work? So the first part, recognizing when you're not aligned with your stakeholders. Now, the challenge with this is the symptoms usually come after you've put in a lot of time and effort and work. No one's going to stop you from designing your study. No one's going to stop you running your study. No one's going to stop you putting together a fantastic report. You only notice there's a problem after you've presented the report, and either teams overtly tell you, I don't believe it, or that's not important, or perhaps worse, it just gets dismissed. Everyone looks at your report, they say, well, that's some great work. And then they go back to whatever they were doing before. That's a slow feedback cycle. And so the symptoms for this problem, you don't notice until, again, you've spent a month at least running a study. What we want to do is identify that earlier and bring that back earlier. The symptoms you will see, though, at the end of the study might be that you end up running studies that are too big for your team, that you're learning a whole bunch of stuff that the team can't act on, and you found hundreds of usability issues, but the team can only ingest 4 or 5 top issues And the majority of the other issues that you found will be ignored because they have limited attention and limited time and they can't address them. Now, in the short term, that might be fine. That's fine that you're doing too much work and finding too many things. But it does imply that there is a misalignment between how you're working and what your team needs. And longer term, that can lead to resistance about the idea of doing user research or the amount of investment that people are giving to it. Running two big studies end up being quite expensive for organizations. And when costs are short and budgets are limited, teams might start thinking, well, we tried doing user research and yes, we got a huge report, but that was really expensive and we didn't use half of it. And because of that, we're not going to do this again. There's a misalignment between the size of the studies you're doing and the needs of the team that you have. Another symptom you might see is low impact studies where you're finding things, but the team believe they already knew this, or that it's not relevant to what they're working on at the time. And ultimately, again, you're finding to get ignored. You find a whole bunch of stuff that the team can't and don't want to act upon. And again, that's going to impact their perception of the value of your work. You'll start to hear comments of, well, we tried user research, but ultimately just told us stuff we already knew. And so what's the point of that? If we already knew the answers, we're not going to bother investing in doing studies again in the future. And yeah, what is the point of this as a process? What you'll see is varying degrees of pushback and hostility from the teams you're working with if you do have that misaligned environment. At the softest end of the scale, that might just be being ignored. You're not invited to the meetings, they're important. Team members don't turn up to your meetings, they don't think it's a good use of their time. They stop putting effort into replying to your questions or giving you the things you need to do your job. And ultimately, the work you're doing is seen as not a priority and not as important as whatever else they're doing with their time. That is a sign that there's a problem here. Other symptoms you might see include pushback to your research work. If you're hearing people say, oh, it's just how can I believe this study has only been at 5 users? What can I do with that? Or they don't agree with who your users are. They say, oh, these aren't our real users. There's something wrong with these players. That's, again, you're only going to hit out the end of your study, but it shows that a problem has existed right from the start. These people are dismissive of your work and they don't see the value of what you do. And so really you've wasted your own time by running the study in that environment. In the worst cases, this could look at like overt hostility, people being dismissive of you individually, being dismissive of the work of a research team. Oh, and that's what we want to avoid. So all of these things, running studies that don't match the need of your teams and getting this kind of resistance from your stakeholders in other disciplines are a symptom that you haven't understood the environment that you're working with and how you're working isn't aligned with how the organization is working. Which leads me to the topic that I wanted to focus on today. Understanding the environment in which decisions are made. Failing to understand this environment can lead to that misalignment and ultimately leads to either you do a bunch of work but everyone ignores it, or teams start to be hostile against your research work. You do a bunch of work and teams say, I don't believe it, which can be worse. Now, this is a very easy trap to fall into. Although it seems trivial and obvious to say, we need to understand the environment in which the decisions we're hoping to influence are being made. Often that's not where playtesting and user research requests start. Depending on the maturity and the experience of your team, the start can often be, well, the team's hit a milestone, they've hit vertical slice or alpha or beta, and because they've hit a milestone, they've put together a special build for it. And because they have the build, they think, well, we've got a build, we might as well do a playtest because we're at the milestone. Sometimes, even worse, they might come in with a specific method in mind. They might say, actually, we need to do a 100-person survey and it needs to be statistically significant. Might be the start of a request to a research team. And these are treating the research process backwards and treating it somewhat as a box ticking exercise. They're running the study because they've hit the milestone, which isn't the point of our work and isn't why we run research studies. Instead, the correct framing for why we run research studies is we want to frame it around the decisions being made. We need to understand what decisions are our team going to make, what decisions are coming up, what risks are they worried about, what actions can they take as a result, and what directions are they considering. And once we've understood those decisions, we need to decide what type of data would help them make a better, more informed decision in that area. Now, instead of treating research as that box ticking exercise, as a thing you do because you've hit a milestone, this is treating it as a way of informing decisions, understand the decisions that need to be made, and use that to decide when we're running research. That ultimately leads to higher impact work. It means that our studies will be relevant for the teams that we work with, and means that we'll be in the right time to actually get listened to. As I mentioned, though, this often isn't how research come to us, and that other framing, hey, we need to do a playtest because we're at a milestone, is more common. So when you are running a research study, when you are a researcher and you're brought a research request for a playtest or for a survey, we need to take a step back. Rather than immediately going and starting to plan and run that playtest or starting to write the survey, we need to step back, understand what's led the team to come to us with this request, and then draw our own conclusion about what we should be doing. A nice comparison that I like to use to explain this idea is really we should be acting like doctors. If you as a patient went to your doctor and said, I need to have my leg amputated, the doctor's unlikely to just start sharpening their bone saw and hacking away. Instead, they'll probably ask you some questions. Why do you feel you need your leg amputated? How long have you felt this way? What are you going to do after your leg's amputated? Those type of framing questions to understand how you got to the point in which you're in. And we need to do the same thing. When our team comes to us and says, we need a playtest or we need a survey, we need to stop, think about actually how the team got to this point, and then decide for ourselves, do they need a playtest? Do they need a survey? Do they need a different method? Do they need some different research objectives? Do they need a study at all? And maybe it's too late and it's not worth the investment to run a study because they're not going to do anything as a result. And the factors that I think are important to think about are the following, each of which I'm going to go into in a bit more depth. We need to make sure we understand the decisions that are going to be made. We need to make sure we understand the people who are making those decisions. We need to recognize their beliefs and how they're incentivized and what's going on in their mind. And last of all, the pragmatic angle, we need to work out when a decision needs to be made so that we can make sure we're in the room at the right time. So that first one, the decisions. Again, I like that framing of the point of research being to inform decisions, and to understand that and to get to that, there are two questions that we need to be exploring with our stakeholders before we decide whether we're going to run a study. First of all, why do they want to run this study? What led them to decide today I'm going to phone up the research team? Phone up is probably a bit out of date. I'm going to send a Slack message to the research team saying we need a playtest, and what led them to that point. We also need to ask them, what are they going to do as a result? What decisions do they think they're going to make as a result of this study or this playtest or the usability study, and make sure that they're clear how they're going to use the data. If they're not clear, you might want to do some more work with them to reframe the study or to understand their objectives and to coax that information out. But ultimately, you want to make sure that you know and they know how they want to use the data from this playtest. All these things can be explored before a kickoff meeting through conversation, and then can be confirmed during your kickoff. And some of the points on my kickoff agenda to address this include making sure we've understood the context and why the team has decided to run a study today. Making sure we do have defined research objectives, actually what do the team hope to learn from this study, and how do they what information do they feel they want to get from this, and what decisions they're going to make as a result. Again, you can imagine as a researcher that there are different approaches for the study we could take, or different ways we could gather the information, or different ways we could present that information. And to work out the most impactful way of doing that, we need to know how the team intends to use this information at the other side. So it's worth explicitly asking what decisions they hope to make. My typical process would be to have conversations with people beforehand, fill out my understanding of these points, and then bring them all to a kickoff meeting where we can discuss and confirm them. However, you might have your own approach for gathering these. I think the important bit is to make sure you are gathering these. So as well as decisions, we also need to make sure we've got the right people involved. And I'm sure people who are researchers already would have experienced that idea of only after you're doing a debrief of a research study are the right people in the room to see your presentation, and they have questions or other research objectives that they wanted answered that you didn't answer because they weren't involved in the research objectives, they weren't involved in the design of the study, and ultimately people get involved too late. We need to make sure that we're noticing that, and all the people who are going to make decisions are involved in your kickoff meeting. Again, the way to get that can just be as simple as conversations with whoever is asking you for the research study, asking them explicitly who needs to know the results of this research study and why do they need to know the results of this research study. Will start to generate your list of who are the stakeholders who need to have oversight of the kickoff and the research objectives, or who do I need to invite to view research sessions, or who do I need to invite to the presentation. Again, this can often fall out of the decisions. If you are having that conversation about what decisions will be made based on this research from the previous step, we can then ask, okay, who makes those decisions, and make sure those people are exposed to our research process so that they are involved at the right time rather than too late when we've failed to find the right things that are relevant to their decisions and we've missed the boat. Now, people aren't entirely logical, fact-absorbing and processing beings, and instead, facts don't change minds and reports don't change minds. And it's very easy for people to objectively know something is true, but do something completely different. That means that we need to also understand, how do decisions get made in this organization? There's a really nice quote here from the researcher Erica Hall, where she talks explicitly about this. She says, organizations are the social context in which design and product decision-making happens. If you don't understand how people make decisions in your organization, you'll never be able to influence them. And that's very true. Once we've found that list of stakeholders, we need to understand, what are their incentives? What are they trying to get done in their day-to-day job? What's hard for them? What decisions they have coming up? What sort of data would help influence those decisions? And make sure we are understanding the decision-making environment in which we're working. This can be a little bit difficult to get to as a concept. It's a bit nebulous. And if you ask someone explicitly, how do decisions get made around here? They might not be able to give you good quality answers. Luckily, as researchers, we have tools for this. And one of the best predictors of future behavior, as we know, is past behavior. So an angle you can use to explore this with teams is asking them about previous research studies they've run. Ask them, okay, last time you ran a research study, what did you learn? What actions happened as a result? And why did you do those actions and not these other actions? By exploring how they have handled research before and how decisions have been made before, you will start to uncover that landscape of decision-making in that environment and start to understand the incentives which individuals and teams are working on. This does seem a bit nebulous and a bit messy, but it is super valuable. Making sure we are spending individual time with each of our stakeholders, understanding what's important to them and their preconceived beliefs about research, about the game they're working on, about what data they need, is incredibly valuable. If you skip it at this point, you're you're going to have these same problems, but you're only going to learn them after you've done your debrief. When you've invested a huge amount of time and effort into doing your study, it's best to learn these things beforehand so it can influence how you decide to do your study. The last dimension to explore before you kick off is also is time around these decisions. I like this framing of when will it be too late to get results? If you ask specifically two teams, when do you need the results of this study? They'll say as soon as possible. And that's because people want things as soon as possible. By this framing, we're explicitly saying, okay, when is too late? When has the decision been made? I think that frames the decision making. It centers the timeline around what decision you're going to make and when are you going to make that decision. And from that, the rest of the study can be derived. Once you know when the decision needs to be made, you can work out, well, before that, we need to have done some analysis. Before that, we need to have run our study. Before that, we need to have done recruitment. And the rest of the dates fall out from decision making. The reason with this is very important is because game development doesn't stop. When a team has a question for research and it takes you 2 or 3 weeks to answer it, the team aren't just going to sit there and wait for the results. Instead, they're going to start making ad hoc decisions and making commitments and, moving on with game development. They can't afford to wait. That means that if you haven't got the information in front of them before the decision has to be made, it can very frequently be too late. They'll make hard commitments that they can't go back from. And again, low impact studies as a result. The turnaround time for research can be quite long. Often some of that time is spent reporting, and it might take you a few days or a week to make a beautiful report suitable for an exec team. Some of the things we can do to bring that timeline down and make sure that we are getting data in front of our developers before they make the decisions can include top-line reports. So at the end of a study, spending a few minutes thinking about, okay, what do we think we've heard from this study, and sharing that with the game team. Now, that's not a formal analysis process, and there's nothing like as good as a real analysis, and you should go and do proper analysis. But in an environment where the team is going to start acting anyway, regardless of and they're not going to wait for you, it's better to have some small influence of that with some rough impressions than wait until your full report is done if that's too late for the team and they've moved on and they're just going to ignore it because it's too late. So sharing some interim findings can be one way. Also, making sure the team are involved in data collection. I'm sure any researcher would recommend inviting the team to come and watch sessions and encouraging them to do so. If they are watching the sessions, you could also ask them to take their own notes. You can ask them to share their notes after. And making sure that teams are involved in that data collection process and are actively engaging with the research data will help them make better decisions before your report is ready. Now, all the things I've talked about, making sure that we understand the people, understand the environment, understand the decisions, understand the time, they can be difficult to get, and teams often can't articulate them without significant prompting. And if you ask teams this explicitly, if you ask them, how do decisions get made around here, they're probably not going to give a good answer. Luckily, you as a researcher, you have your own toolkit of research methods that you can use to understand the domain and apply your research skills to understanding the environment you work in. If you're embedded, some of the ways you can do this include meeting people and interviewing them, talking to them, reasonably informal, just catch-ups with your stakeholders and buy them a cup of coffee and ask them questions about what are they working on and what's hard for them currently and what decisions they have coming up and how are they going to make these decisions. This is a research study. You're understanding your stakeholders with research skills, but it will arm you with an understanding of their mental model and how their world works so that you can be much more precise and targeted with how you position your own work and how you present your work to that person. So meeting people with coffees and just asking them, what are you up to, can get you quite far. Sitting in meetings, even ones that aren't research related directly will help you understand the teams you work with and their decision-making process and how they work currently. And again, will be hugely revealing. Decision-making is often about trust rather than hard evidence. And so you need to build the trust of your stakeholders. And again, if you're doing these first few things like sitting in meetings and talking with them about what they're working on, the problems might be revealed or questions that they have. And you as a researcher might be able to do small things to start to build up trust. That could be you found a relevant article to one of the questions that they've asked, and you're sharing this article because it's relevant to what they're working on. Or you've run a different research study and found something that you think is interesting for this other team. Sharing findings across teams will be another small thing that you can do if you have a better understanding of how your team works. Another technique I find really helpful is end-of-day wrap-ups after research days. If your team have come and viewed the session, at the end of the day, instead of you telling them what you saw, instead asking them what they saw from that session and what they think has happened and what they've taken away from the research session. Again, that starts to reveal their mental model and what's important to them and what's resonating with them, and arms you with that understanding about what's going on in their heads so that we can be more intentional about how we position our findings or intervene if we need to intervene. That yes, it just reveals what's going on in the heads of our stakeholders. As an external consultant, I am often not embedded with the teams I work with. And some of these things can be harder as an external person. Some ways I try and work around that is asking to read everything the team has. Now, a lot of teams these days won't have a formal game design document, but they might have internal wikis, or they might have pitch documents, or they might have stuff written down that reveals the vision of the game and what they're working on and what they're thinking. And making sure that I'm aware of that and aligned with that will help me have more impact. Probably the most impactful tool I have is that kickoff. Before the kickoff, asking questions and filling out all the things we talked about already, and then asking further questions during the kickoff to help build that alignment is very impactful as a tool. Again, we talked about how in the kickoff, it'll probably become clear that some of the decision makers are not involved in the study, they're not commissioning the study, and they're not in the meetings with you. Asking to meet those people and spending some time just to understand what they're doing and what they're hoping to get from the study, and being proactive in reaching out to these other people will be very valuable. And as we talked about, the best indicator of future behavior is past behavior. And so making sure after we run a study, we ask teams, what did you do as a result of that study? What did you listen to? What did you act on? What did you not act on? And why will help us understand how decision making gets done and iterate our process and iterate how we do our work when we run a next study with that same team. Ultimately, this is the rest of the research process comes after this. So only once we've understand that decision-making environment can we do the right work to plan our study, to prepare how we're going to run the study and how we're going to share results at the other side. All of these steps should come after understanding the environment in which we're working and the people that we're working with. I'm optimistic, though, that by doing these steps, by making sure we are giving appropriate attention to understand our environments, to understand our stakeholders, it will lead to higher impact studies. It will lead to greater engagement with our research process. And ultimately, that has a lot of benefits for research teams. It means more funding, more investment, more of a priority in the development process, and overall better outcomes for the games that we make. So this has been a very quick read through this topic. As I'm sure you can tell, I could ramble on about this in a lot more detail, and we could talk about some of the ways that it applies to the teams that you work with and specific techniques for dealing with that. I'm really open to talking about user research at any point. My email address is on the website gamesuserresearch.com, and happy to chat about these topics. Also, as mentioned, I run studies for teams. I train individuals and coach teams and leaders and help teams build up their research maturity and skills in-house. If any of these things you want to explore in more depth in a formal setting, again, get in touch. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope everyone enjoys the other talks as part of this series. Thank you.